In February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the entire Western world expected this to be Russia's final catastrophic miscalculation. The sanctions were ready. The financial weapons were loaded. The economic isolation would be total. Within months, the Russian economy would collapse. Putin's regime would face internal revolt. Russia would be forced to retreat, humiliated, weakened, perhaps triggering the end of Putin's rule entirely. That was the plan. That was the confident prediction from every major Western think tank, every intelligence agency, every financial institution. Russia had made a fatal error. The West would exploit it ruthlessly. By 2025, Russia would be a cautionary tale about challenging American-led order. Here's what actually happened. In 2025, nearly 3 years after the invasion, the Russian economy is growing at 3 to 4% annually, according to IMF estimates. Russian oil exports continue at 8 to 9 million barrels per day, only moderately below pre-war levels. Russian government finances are stable. The ruble, after initial collapse, has recovered and stabilized. Russian military, despite enormous casualties and equipment losses, continues fighting effectively and shows no signs of imminent collapse. Putin's domestic position appears secure with no visible threat to his rule. Meanwhile, the West has fired essentially every economic weapon in its arsenal: comprehensive sanctions, asset freezes, technology export bans, exclusion from SWIFT, seizure of $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, price caps on Russian oil, everything short of direct military intervention. And Russia is still standing, not just surviving, growing economically, fighting militarily, maintaining social stability, operating internationally through partnerships with China, India, and dozens of other countries willing to work around Western restrictions. So here's the question. Nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly. If the West threw everything it had at Russia economically and Russia didn't collapse, what does that reveal about the actual limits of American economic power and the real balance of global power in 2025? Because the answer is deeply uncomfortable. Russia broke the global power balance not through military conquest, but by demonstrating that comprehensive Western economic warfare isn't decisive if you have alternatives. And those alternatives exist in 2025 in ways they didn't exist during the Cold War. China provides them. India provides them. The entire non-Western world provides them by refusing to join sanctions and continuing to engage with Russia commercially. The move that broke the power balance was Russia's survival. The survival nobody expected. The survival that proves American-led economic coercion can be resisted, endured, and ultimately outlasted if you're willing to pay the costs and if you can find partners who won't join the isolation campaign. Let me show you how Russia actually survived the sanctions, because understanding the mechanism reveals why this breaks the global power balance fundamentally. Start with energy, the foundation of Russian economy and state finances. Russian oil production before the war was roughly 11 million barrels per day. After sanctions, it fell to maybe 9 to 9.5 million barrels per day in early 2022. Western analysts predicted it would collapse to 5 to 6 million barrels per day or lower, as sanctions prevented exports and technology restrictions prevented maintenance of complex oil fields. This didn't happen. By 2025, Russian oil production is back to roughly 9 to 9.5 million barrels per day and stable. Why didn't it collapse? Because Russia found buyers. China now imports over 2 million barrels per day of Russian oil. India imports 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. Turkey, UAE, and others import significant volumes. These countries buy at discounted prices, giving Russia less revenue per barrel than pre-war. But Russia gets enough revenue to keep the economy functioning. The oil moves through shadow fleet of tankers operating with transponders off, insurance through non-Western companies, payments through non-Western banks. The entire infrastructure of sanctions evasion has been built at scale. Western efforts to track and stop these flows have been partially successful at best. Russian natural gas faced bigger disruption because pipelines to Europe were cut or damaged, but Russia redirected some gas to China through Power of Siberia pipeline, carrying roughly 40 billion cubic meters annually by 2025. Russia also increased LNG exports to Asia. The gas revenue declined significantly, but didn't disappear entirely. Now let me tell you about the financial system, because this is where Russia's survival is most remarkable. When the West cut major Russian banks from SWIFT and froze central bank reserves, this was supposed to be financial nuclear weapon. Russian banks couldn't process international transactions. Russian central bank couldn't access hundreds of billions in foreign reserves. The financial system should have ceased. Instead, Russia switched to alternative systems. Payments with China flow through CIPs, China's alternative to SWIFT. Payments with India use rupee-ruble exchanges. Payments with Turkey and Central Asian countries use various bilateral arrangements. Russian domestic payment system MIR handles transactions inside Russia. SPFS, Russia's alternative to SWIFT, connects with foreign banks willing to transact with Russia. These systems are clunkier than SWIFT. Transactions take longer. There are more friction and costs, but they work. Money flows. Trade happens. The Russian financial system didn't collapse because alternatives existed that nobody in the West took seriously until they were already operational at scale. The frozen central bank reserves hurt significantly. Russia lost access to $300 billion in wealth. But this was one-time loss, not recurring damage. And it taught every other country watching that holding reserves in Western currencies and Western banks means those reserves can be seized for political reasons. This lesson is accelerating de-dollarization globally, a strategic own goal by the West. Let me show you what happened with imports, because sanctions were supposed to prevent Russia from importing critical goods, crippling industry and living standards. Russia can't import advanced semiconductors from the West anymore. Can't import machinery from Europe, can't import consumer goods from America. So Russia imports from China instead. Chinese exports to Russia have surged. By 2025, Russia-China trade exceeds $240 billion annually, more than doubling from pre-war levels. Russia imports everything from China: electronics, machinery, vehicles, consumer goods, industrial equipment. Yes, some of this is more expensive or lower quality than Western alternatives, but it's available. Russia also imports through intermediaries in Central Asia, Turkey, UAE. Goods manufactured in the West or East Asia flow to these countries, then get re-exported to Russia, often with minimal disguise. The sanctions evasion networks are sophisticated and large-scale. Western technology restrictions have forced Russia to develop some indigenous capabilities or substitute lower-tech alternatives. This has costs. Russian military equipment increasingly uses commercial components because military-grade chips aren't available. Russian industries operate with less efficiency because cutting-edge machinery isn't accessible. But none of this has been catastrophic. Russia's economy has adapted. It's less efficient than before, but it functions. People have access to goods. Industries operate. The economy grows at 3 to 4% annually, despite everything the West has thrown at it. Now let me tell you about what happened militarily, because this reveals another dimension of Russian resilience nobody expected. Western intelligence assessed that Russian military would run out of precision weapons within months, that tank and artillery losses would become unsustainable, that manpower shortages would force Russia to reduce operations. By 2025, none of this has proven true. Russian military continues fighting at scale. Artillery fire rates remain high. Missiles strike Ukrainian targets regularly. Tank losses are replaced through production and refurbishment of Soviet-era stocks. Manpower is sustained through mobilization and recruitment despite casualties exceeding hundreds of thousands. How? Russian military-industrial complex ramped to wartime production. Factories operate multiple shifts. Soviet-era equipment is refurbished. North Korea provides artillery shells. Iran provides drones. China provides dual-use components. Russia's internal capacity to sustain war effort, while strained, hasn't broken. The West provided Ukraine with over $100 billion in military aid by 2025, advanced weapon systems, real-time intelligence training, and Ukraine is fighting bravely and effectively. But Russia hasn't been defeated. The front lines have been largely static through 2024-2025. This isn't Ukrainian failure. This is Russian resilience exceeding all Western predictions. Let me show you what this means for global power balance, because the implications cascade across multiple domains. First, sanctions credibility. American economic coercion depends on targets believing that resistance is futile, that costs will be unbearable, that capitulation is inevitable. Russia's survival destroys this credibility. Every country facing American sanctions now looks at Russia and calculates, if Russia can survive the most comprehensive Western sanctions in modern history, maybe we can too. Iran has believed this for decades. Venezuela learned it. North Korea demonstrated it. But Russia's scale makes the lesson universal. Sanctions become negotiating position rather than decisive pressure. Countries' sanction targets endure. They find alternatives. They pay costs, but survive. And eventually, the sanctioning power must decide whether permanent estrangement serves interests or whether engagement must resume despite sanctions having failed to achieve objectives. Second, military deterrence. NATO expansion to Russia's borders was justified partly by assumption that Russia couldn't effectively resist militarily and that economic dependence on the West would constrain Russian response to threats. Both assumptions proved false. Russia was willing to use military force despite economic consequences, and Russia has proven capable of sustaining major military operations for years despite Western opposition and support for its adversary. This demonstrates that Russia remains a serious military power that can't be pushed beyond certain thresholds without triggering forceful response. NATO hasn't expanded further since the Ukraine war began. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, but nobody is discussing Ukraine or Georgia membership anymore, despite pre-war momentum. Why? Because Russia demonstrated that it will fight rather than accept certain outcomes, and because Russia's ability to sustain that fight proved greater than anticipated. Third, alliance cohesion. The West's response to Ukraine has shown both unity and limits. NATO members provided substantial aid. Sanctions were comprehensive, but beyond that, unity frays. Europe is tired of war costs. Some countries want negotiations. Hungary openly opposes sanctions. Turkey maintains Russian relations. The United States faces domestic pressure to reduce aid. Russia has simply waited for this unity to erode. By 2025, Western resolve is clearly weakening. Aid packages face political opposition. Sanctions are being circumvented openly by countries like India and China. Russia calculates that time favors them because sustaining support for Ukraine is harder for democracies than sustaining war effort is for Russian authoritarian system. Now, let me tell you about what's happening with China-Russia partnership, because this is the move within the move that really broke the power balance. Russia's survival isn't solo achievement. It's enabled by comprehensive Chinese support that short-circuits Western isolation strategy. China buys Russian oil, providing billions in monthly revenue. Chinese banks process Russian payments. Chinese manufacturers supply Russian industries. Chinese companies fill gaps left by Western companies. China provides diplomatic cover through UN Security Council veto power. By 2025, Russia-China trade exceeds $240 billion annually, making China Russia's economic lifeline. But it's not just economics. This is strategic partnership. China and Russia coordinate diplomatically opposing Western positions globally. They conduct joint military exercises demonstrating operational cooperation. They align on technology standards, creating non-Western systems. They cooperate on payment infrastructure, building alternatives to SWIFT. The China-Russia partnership isn't formal alliance, but it's comprehensive strategic alignment that gives both countries alternatives to Western systems and the ability to resist Western pressure that would be effective against either country alone, but isn't effective against both together. This breaks the power balance because it means American economic and military dominance isn't decisive against major powers who coordinate resistance. Russia provides military capability and resource wealth. China provides economic scale and technological sophistication. Together they create pole of power that can sustain itself outside Western order. Let me show you what's happening with the global south, because Russia's survival is teaching lessons that extend far beyond Russia. India continues importing Russian oil despite Western pressure. In fact, India has become Russia's second largest oil customer. Indian position is clear. We'll maintain relations with all major powers and pursue Indian interests regardless of Western preferences. Turkey, a NATO member, increased trade with Russia. UAE maintained relations. Saudi Arabia coordinates oil policy with Russia through OPEC+. Brazil refuses to sanction Russia. South Africa provides diplomatic support. Indonesia maintains neutrality. These aren't minor countries. These are major regional powers representing billions of people. The global south watched the West try to isolate Russia and concluded that the era of automatic alignment with Western positions is over. Countries have options now. They can trade with Russia, with China, with everyone simultaneously. They don't need to choose sides. And Western threats of consequences ring hollow, because imposing sanctions on dozens of major countries simultaneously would isolate the West more than the targets. This is multipolar world emerging in practice, not through formal declaration, through accumulated decisions by countries worldwide to resist Western pressure to isolate Russia. Each country that maintains Russian relations, that refuses sanctions, demonstrates that American-led coercion can be resisted collectively. Now, let me tell you about what Russia demonstrated about resource power, because this breaks power balance in ways that will matter for decades. Russia controls massive energy and commodity resources. When the West thought they could dictate terms to Russia through economic pressure, Russia demonstrated that countries that control resources needed by global economy have leverage that financial weapons can't overcome. The West needs energy. Europe tried to replace Russian gas and faced enormous costs, industrial shutdowns, economic pain. By 2025, Europe still imports some Russian gas indirectly and some directly through pipelines that weren't cut. Complete elimination proved impossible without unacceptable economic damage. The world needs wheat. Russia is a top wheat exporter. During the war, wheat prices spiked, causing food security crises globally. Russia used wheat exports as leverage, demonstrating that commodity producers have power over commodity consumers, regardless of financial system control. This is a lesson for resource-rich countries globally. If you control things the world needs, you have power that American financial dominance can't negate. Saudi Arabia learned this decades ago with oil. Russia is relearning it. Other countries are watching and understanding that resource nationalism can succeed against Western pressure. Let me show you what American allies are learning, because Russia's survival reveals limits of American security guarantees and economic leadership. European countries provided Ukraine with aid, but they're exhausted by costs and losing hope that Russia can be defeated. By 2025, many Europeans want negotiated settlement, even if it means Ukraine cedes territory. The United States pushed for maximum pressure on Russia, but couldn't sustain European unity indefinitely. American security guarantee to Europe is supposed to be ironclad, but if America can't organize effective response to Russian aggression against European neighbor, what does that guarantee actually mean in practice? Asian allies like Japan and South Korea watch and calculate. If Russia can invade neighbor and survive Western response, what happens if China acts against Taiwan or North Korea against South Korea? Will American-led response be effective? Or will it be impressive initially, but unsustainable long-term, allowing aggressor to outlast Western resolve? These doubts don't mean allies abandon America, but they mean allies hedge more. They build independent capabilities. They maintain relations with China. They calculate that exclusive American alignment might be insufficient for their security. Now, let me tell you about what 2027, 2030 looks like if current trajectories continue, because Russia's move has opened pathways others will follow. Russia will still be under sanctions, but will have adjusted completely. Trade with China, India, Middle East, Africa will be normalized. Russian economy will have restructured around Eastern rather than Western orientation. Other countries facing Western pressure will use Russian playbook. Find alternative trading partners, build sanctions evasion networks, sustain yourself through the pressure period knowing Western resolve eventually weakens. This makes American economic coercion progressively less effective over time as more countries demonstrate it can be resisted. China will be emboldened by Russia's survival. If Russia can endure maximum Western economic warfare, China certainly can, given its much larger economy and more sophisticated industrial base. This makes Chinese calculations about Taiwan less constrained by fear of Western economic response. The global power balance will be genuinely multipolar. Western economic weapons won't be decisive. Military dominance won't translate to strategic outcomes against major powers willing to accept costs. American leadership will face constant challenge from countries that don't need American approval to pursue interests. Now, let me tell you what troubles me most about this situation. And it's not that Russia invaded Ukraine or that sanctions failed. It's that Western policy was based on assumptions about American economic omnipotence that proved false, and there's little indication that policymakers have absorbed this lesson. The belief that comprehensive sanctions must work because American financial power is overwhelming led to strategy that failed and left the West without good options. Russia survived, Ukraine is exhausted, Western unity is fraying, and no path to victory is visible. Russia just broke the global power balance, not through strength, but through endurance, not through defeating the West militarily, but through proving Western economic warfare isn't decisive. And America wasn't ready for this move because American strategy assumed dominance that no longer exists. In 2025, the balance is broken, the power is multipolar, and the move that changed everything was Russia's simple survival when everyone expected collapse. That survival is the fact that reshapes how global power works going forward. Not America defeated, but America not omnipotent, and that difference is everything.